Swann's Way, Swan in Love, Part 2, by Marcel Proust. It so happened that my grandfather had known, which was more than could be said of any of their present friends, the family of these Veterans. But he had entirely severed his connection with what he called young Vetaran, taking a general view of him as one who had fallen, though without losing hold of his millions, among the riffraff of Bohemia. One day he received a letter from Swann asking whether my grandfather could put him in touch with the Veterans. On guard, he exclaimed. I am not at all surprised. Swann was bound to finish up like this. A fine set of people. I cannot do what he asks, because, in the first place, I no longer know the gentleman in question. Besides, there must be a woman in it somewhere, and I don't lend a hand to such affairs. Ah, well, we'll have some fun if Swann gets mixed up with the little Veterans. And on my grandfather's negative reply, it was Odette herself who had taken Swann to the house. The Veterans had invited to dinner, on the day when Swann made his first appearance, Dr. and Madame Cottard, the young pianist and his aunt, and the painter then in favor, and these were joined in the course of the evening by several more of the faithful. Dr. Cottard was never quite certain of the tone in which he ought to reply to anyone, or whether the speaker was jesting or in earnest, and so in any event he would embellish all his facial expressions with the offer of a conditional, a provisional smile, whose expectant subtlety would exonerate him from the charge of being a simpleton, if the remark addressed to him should turn out to have been facetious. But as he must also be prepared to face the alternative, he never dared allow to this smile a definite expression on his features. And you would see there perpetually floating an uncertainty in which you might decipher the question that he dared not ask. Do you really mean what you're saying? He was no more confident of the manner in which he ought to conduct himself in the street, or indeed in life generally, than he was in a drawing-room, and he might be seen greeting passer-by, carriages, and anything that occurred with a malicious smile that absolved his subsequent behavior of all impropriety, since it proved, if it should turn out unsuited to the occasion, that he was well aware of that, and that if he had assumed a smile, it was only for fun. On all those points, however, where a direct question appeared to him to be permissible, the doctor was unsparing in his endeavors to reduce the scope of his uncertainty and so to complete his education. So it was that, following the advice given him by a wise mother on his first coming up to the capital from his provincial home, he would never let pass either a figure of speech or a proper name that was new to him without an effort to secure the fullest information about it. As regards figures of speech, he was insatiable for information, for, often imagining them to have a more definite meaning than was actually the case, he would want to know what exactly was intended by those that he most frequently heard use the bloom of youth, blue blood, a cat and dog life, the hour of reckoning, a prince of fashion, to give a free rein to be floored, and so forth, and in what particular circumstances he himself might make use of them in conversation. Failing these, he would resort to puns that he had learned by rote. As for the names of strangers that were uttered in his presence, he used merely to repeat them in a questioning tone, which he thought would suffice to furnish him with explanations that he would not appear to be seeking. The critical faculty, on the universal application of which he prided himself, was completely lacking in him. The refinement of good breeding that consists in assuring someone whom you are obliging in any way, without expecting to be believed, that it is really yourself that is obliged to him, was wasted on Cottard, who took everything that he heard in its literal sense. However blind she may have been to his faults, Madame Vetaran was genuinely annoyed though she had still continued to regard him as very intelligent, when after she invited him to see Sarah Bernhardt from a stage box, and had said politely, "It is very good of you to have come, doctor, especially as I'm sure you must often have heard Sarah Bernhardt, and besides, we may be too near the stage." The doctor, who had come into the box with a smile that waited before settling on or vanishing from his face until someone in authority would enlighten him as to the merits of the spectacle, replied, "To be sure, we are far too near the stage, and one is getting sick of Sarah Bernhardt. But you expressed a wish that I should come. For me, your wish is a command. I am only too glad to be able to do you this little service. What would not do to please you? You are so good." And so he went on. "Sarah Bernhardt, she's indeed the one they call the golden voice, isn't she? You see it written often, too, that she sets the boards on fire. That's an odd expression, isn't it? In the hope of commentaries that were not forthcoming. You know," Madame Vetaran said to her husband, "I believe we are on the wrong track when, out of modesty, we disparage anything we offer the doctor. He is a scientist who lives quite apart from everyday life. He knows nothing himself of what things are worth, and he relies on what we tell him." "I never dared to mention it," Monsieur Vetaran had answered, "but I've noticed the same thing myself." And on the following New Year's Day, instead of sending Dr. Cottard a ruby that cost 3,000 francs and pretending that it was a mere trifle, Monsieur Vetaran bought an artificial stone for 300 and let it be understood that it was nearly impossible to find one as beautiful. When Madame Vetaran had announced that they were to see Monsieur Swann that evening, "Swan!" the doctor had exclaimed, in a tone rendered brutal by his astonishment, for the smallest piece of news would always take completely unawares this man who imagined himself to be perpetually ready for anything. And seeing that no one answered him, "Swan? Who on earth is Swan?" he shouted in a frenzy of anxiety that subsided as soon as Madame Vetaran had explained. "Why, Odette's friend, whom she told us about." "Ah, good. That's all right then," answered the doctor, at once mollified. As for the painter, he was overjoyed at the prospect of Swann's appearing at the Veterans because he supposed him to be in love with Odette and was always ready to encourage such liaisons. "Nothing amuses me more than bringing about marriages," he confided to Cottard. "I have already brought about many, even between women." In telling the Veterans that Swann was extremely smart, Odette had alarmed them with the prospect of another bore. When he arrived, however, he made an excellent impression, an indirect cause of which, though they did not know it, was his familiarity with the best society. He had indeed one of those advantages that men who have lived and moved in the world enjoy over others, even men of intelligence and refinement who have never gone into society, namely, that they no longer see it transfigured by the longing or repulsion with which it fills the imagination, but regard it as quite unimportant. Their amiability, freed from all snobbishness and from the fear of seeming too amiable, grown independent in fact, has the ease, the grace of movement of those whose supple limbs will carry out precisely the movement that is required, without any rash or maladroit participation by the rest of his body. The simple and elementary gestures used by a man of the world when he courteously holds out his hand to the unknown youth who is being introduced to him, and when he bows discreetly before the ambassador to whom he is being introduced, had gradually pervaded, without his being conscious of it, the whole of Swann's social deportment, so that in the company of people of a lower grade than his own, such as the Veterans and their friends, he instinctively showed an assiduity, and made overtures with which, by their account, any of their bores would have dispensed. He chilled, though for a moment only, on meeting Dr. Cottard. For seeing him wink at him with an ambiguous smile before they had yet spoken to one another, a dumb show that Cottard styled the old come-on, Swann supposed that the doctor recognized him from having met him already somewhere, probably in some house of ill repute, though these he himself very rarely visited, having never led a life of debauchery. Regarding such an allusion as in bad taste, especially before Odette, whose opinion of himself it might easily alter for the worse, Swann assumed his most icy manner, but when he learned that the lady next to the doctor was Madame Cottard, he decided that so young a husband would not deliberately in his wife's hearing have made any allusion to amusements of that order, and so ceased to interpret the doctor's expression in the sense that he had at first feared. The painter at once invited Swann to visit his studio with Odette, and Swann found him very pleasant. "Perhaps you will be more favored than I have been," Madame Vetaran broke in, with mock resentment of the favor. "Perhaps you will be allowed to see Cottard's portrait," for which she had given the painter a commission. "Take care, Master Biche," she reminded the painter, whom it was a time-honored pleasantry to address as master, "to catch that nice look in his eyes, that witty little twinkle. You know, what I have to have most of all is his smile. That's what I've asked you to paint, the portrait of his smile." And since the phrase struck her as noteworthy, she repeated it very loud, so as to make sure that as many people as possible of her guests should hear it, and even made use of some vague pretext to draw the circle closer before she uttered it again. Swann asked to be introduced to everyone, even to an old friend of the Veterans called Saniette, whose shyness, simplicity, and good nature had deprived him of all the consideration due to his skill as an archivist, his large fortune, and the distinguished family to which he belonged. When he spoke, his words came with a prattle that was delightful to hear, because one felt that it indicated not so much a defect in his speech as a quality of his soul, like a survival from the innocence of a childhood which he had never lost. All the consonants that he did not manage to pronounce seemed like so many harsh sounds of which his lips were incapable. By asking to be introduced to Monsieur Saniette, Swann made Madame Vetaran reverse the usual form of introduction, saying, in fact, with emphasis on the distinction, "Monsieur Swann, would you be so kind as to let me present to you our friend, Saniette?" But he aroused in Saniette himself a warmth of gratitude, which, however, the Veterans never disclosed to Swann, since Saniette rather annoyed them, and they did not feel bound to provide him with friends. On the other hand, the Veterans were extremely touched by Swann's next request, for he felt that he must be asked to be introduced to the pianist's aunt. She wore a black dress, as was her custom, for she believed that a woman always looked good in black, and that nothing could be more distinguished. But her face was exceedingly red, as it was for some time after a meal. She bowed to Swann with deference, but drew herself up again with great dignity, as she was entirely uneducated and was afraid of making mistakes in French. She purposely used to speak in an indistinct and garbling manner, thinking that if she should make a slip, it would be so buried in the surrounding confusion that no one could be certain whether she had actually made it, so that her talk was a sort of blurred expectoration, out of which would emerge from time to time the rare words of which she felt positive. Swann supposed himself entitled to poke a mild little fun at her conversation with Monsieur Vetaran, who, however, was offended. "She is such an excellent woman," he rejoined. "I grant you that she is not exactly brilliant, but I assure you that she is charming when you chat alone with her." "I'm sure she is," Swann hastened to concede. "All I meant was that she hardly struck me as distinguished." He went on, isolating the adjective. "And after all, that is something of a compliment." "Wait a moment," said Monsieur Vetaran. "Now this will surprise you. She writes quite delightfully. You've never heard her nephew play? It is admirable, eh, Doctor? Would you like me to ask him to play something, Monsieur Swann?" "I should count myself most fortunate," Swann was beginning to reply, when the doctor broke in derisively. Having once heard it said in general conversation, emphasis and the use of formal expressions were out of date. Whenever he heard a solemn word used seriously, as the word fortunate had been used just now, he at once assumed that the speaker was being deliberately pompous. And if, moreover, the same word happened to occur in what he called an old cliché, however common it might still be in current usage, the doctor supposed that the phrase just begun was a joke, and interrupted with the remaining words of the quotation, which he seemed to charge the speaker with having intended to introduce at that point, although in reality it had never entered his mind. "Most fortunate for France," he recited wickedly, shooting up both arms with great vigor. Monsieur Vetaran could not help laughing. "What are all those good people laughing at over there? There's no sign of brooding melancholy down in your corner," shouted Madame Vetaran. "You don't suppose I find it very amusing to be stuck up here by myself on the stool of repentance," she went on peevishly, mimicking a child. Madame Vetaran was sitting high on a Swedish chair of waxed pine wood, which a violinist from that country had given her, and that she had kept, although its form reminded you of a stool and clashed with the really fine antique furniture that she had. But she made a point of displaying the presents that the faithful were in the habit of making her from time to time, so that the donors might have the pleasure of seeing them there when they came to the house. And yet, she tried to persuade them to confine their gifts to flowers and sweets, which at least had the merit of mortality, but she was never successful. And the house was gradually filled with a collection of foot warmers, cushions, clocks, screens, barometers, and vases, a constant repetition and a boundless accumulation of incongruous New Year's Day's presents. From this lofty perch, she would take her spirited part in the conversation of the faithful, and would revel in all their farces. But since the accident to her jaw, she had abandoned the effort of actually bursting out laughing, and had substituted a kind of symbolic dumb show that signified, without endangering or even fatiguing her in any way, that she was laughing, until she cried. And at least witticism aimed by any of the circle against a bore or against a former member of the circle who was now relegated to the camp of bores, and to the utter despair of Monsieur Vetaran, who was always made out that he was just as easily amused as his wife, but who, since his laughter was the real thing, was out of breath in a moment, and so was overtaken and vanquished by her device of a feigned but continuous hilarity. She would utter a little cry, shut tight her little bird-like eyes, which were beginning to be clouded over by a cataract, and quickly, as though she had only just time to avoid some indecent sight or to parry a mortal blow, burying her face in her hands, which completely covered it, and prevented her from seeing anything at all, she would appear to be struggling to suppress, to annihilate a laugh which, were she to give way to it, would have caused her to lose consciousness. So stupefied with the gaiety of the faithful, drunk with good fellowship, slander, and acquiescence, Madame Vetaran, perched on her high seat like a bird whose biscuit had been dipped in mulled wine, would sob with amiability. Meanwhile, Monsieur Vetaran, after first asking Swann's permission to light his pipe, no ceremony here, you understand, we're all pals, went and begged the young musician to sit down at the piano. "Come now, don't bother him. He hasn't come here to be tormented," cried Madame Vetaran. "I won't have him tormented." "But why on earth should it bother him?" rejoined Monsieur Vetaran. "I'm sure Monsieur Swann has never heard the sonata nef shot that we discovered. He's going to play us the arrangement for piano." No, not my sonata," she sounded. "I don't want to be made to cry until I get a cold in the head and neuralgia all the way down my face like last time. Thanks for the favor. I don't intend to go through that again. How kind you all are. It is easy to see that none of you will have to stay in bed for a week." This little scene, which was reenacted as often as the young pianist sat down to play, never failed to delight the little clan, as though each of them were witnessing it for the first time, as proof of the seductive originality of the mistress and of her musical sensitiveness. Those nearest to her would signal the others, who were smoking or playing cards at the other end of the room, to gather around. Something was happening, telling them, as one does in Reichstag at moments of great interest, "Here, here." And the next day they would commiserate with those who had been prevented from coming that evening, assuring them that the scene had been even more amusing than usual. Well, all right then, it's agreed, said Monsieur Vetaran. He can play just the andante. Just the andante? How you do go on, cried Madame Vetaran, as if it were just the andante that breaks every bone in my body. The master is really too priceless, just as though, in the ninth, he said we need only have the finale or just the overture of the Meistersinger. The doctor, however, urged Madame Vetaran to let the pianist play, not because he supposed her to be pretending when she spoke of the distressing effects that music always has on her, for he recognized therein certain neurasthenic conditions, but from the habit that many doctors have of at once relaxing the strict letter of a prescription as soon as it appears to jeopardize something that seems to them far more important, like the success of some social gathering at which they are present, and which the person they are advising to forget for once his dyspepsia or his flu is an essential factor. You won't be ill this time, you'll see, he told her, seeking to subdue her mind by the magnetism of his gaze. And if you are ill, we will cure you. Will you really? Madame Vetaran spoke as though, with so great a favor in store for her, there was nothing for it but to capitulate. Perhaps, too, by dint of saying that she was going to be ill, there were moments in which she no longer remembered that it was all a lie, and adopted an invalid's perspective, for it may often be remarked that invalids grow weary of having the rarity of their attacks depend always on their own prudence, and like to let themselves think they can do with impunity everything that they enjoy, although they are usually ill afterward, provided only that they place themselves in the hands of a higher authority who, without putting them to the least inconvenience, can and will, by uttering a word or by administering a pill, put them once again back on their feet. Odette had gone to sit on a tapestry-covered sofa near the piano. You know I have my own little corner here, she said to Madame Vetaran. You're not at all comfortable there. Go and sit by Odette. You can easily make room for Monsieur Swann there, can't you, Odette? Said Madame Vetaran, seeing Swann by himself on a chair. What a pretty bouveau, said Swann before sitting down on it, wishing to be polite. Ah, I'm glad you appreciate my sofa, replied Madame Vetaran. And I warn you that if you expect ever to see another as beautiful, you may as well abandon the idea at once. They never made any more like it, and these little chairs, too, are perfect marvels. You can look at them in a moment. The emblems in each of the bronze moldings correspond to the subject of the tapestry on the chair. You know, you'll find plenty to amuse you if you take a good look at them. I can promise you a delightful time. Just look at the little border around the edges. Here, look, the little vine on a red background in this one, the bear and the grapes. Isn't it well drawn? What do you say? I think they knew a thing or two about design. Doesn't it make your mouth water, this vine? My husband makes out that I'm not fond of fruit because I eat less than he does. But not at all. I am greedier than any of you. But I have no need to fill my mouth with them when I can savor them with my eyes. What are you all laughing at now, pray? Ask the doctor. He will tell you that those grapes act on me like a regular purge. Some people go to Fontainebleau for cures. I take my own little Bouveau cure here. But, Monsieur Swann, you mustn't run away without feeling the little bronze moldings on the backs. Isn't the patina soft? No, not like that. With your whole hands. Feel them properly. Ah, if Madame Vetaran starts fondling her brasses, said the painter, we won't get any music tonight. Be quiet, you wretch. And yet we poor women, she said, turning around toward Swann, are forbidden pleasures far less voluptuous than this. There is no flesh comparable to this. None. When Monsieur Vetaran did me the honor of being madly jealous, come now, you might at least be polite. Don't say that you never have been jealous. But, my dear, I have absolutely nothing. I've said nothing. Look here, doctor. I call you as a witness. Did I utter a word? Swan had begun, out of politeness, to finger the bronzes and dared not stop too soon. Come along. You can caress them later. Now, it is you who are going to be caressed. Caressed in the ear. You'll like that, I think. Here's the young man who will see to it. After the pianist had played, Swan was even more friendly toward him than toward any other of the guests. Here's why. The year before, at a soiree, he had heard a musical work played on the piano and violin. At first, he had appreciated only the material quality of the sounds that those instruments secreted, and that had already been a source of keen pleasure when, below the little line of the violin part, delicate but unyielding, compact and commanding the whole, he had suddenly perceived, where it was trying to surge upward in a liquid lapping of waves, the mass of the piano part, multiform, indivisible, smooth, and clashing like the mauve tumult of waves, charmed and softened by the moonlight. But at a given moment, without being able to distinguish any clear outline, or to give a name to what was pleasing him, suddenly, enraptured, he tried to catch and retain the phrase or harmony. He knew not which, that had just passed through the air, and had opened and expanded his soul just as the fragrance of certain roses wafting on the moist air of evening has the power of dilating our nostrils. Perhaps it was owing to his own ignorance of music that he had been able to experience so confused an impression, one of those impressions that are perhaps nevertheless our only purely musical impressions, unlimited in their range, entirely original and irreducible into any other order of impressions. An impression of this kind, lasting an instant, is, so to speak, sine materia. Undoubtedly, the notes that we hear at such moments tend, according to their pitch and dynamics, to spread out before our eyes surfaces of varying dimensions, to trace arabesques, to give us the sensation of breath, tenuity, stability, caprice. But the notes themselves have vanished before these sensations have developed sufficiently in us to escape submersion under those that the following or even simultaneous notes have already begun to awaken. And this impression would continue to envelope in its liquidity and its fondue the motifs that now and then emerge, barely discernible, to plunge again and disappear, recognized only by the particular kind of pleasure that they give, impossible to describe, to recollect, to name, ineffable if our memory, like a laborer who toils to lay down firm foundations beneath the tumult of the phrases, enable us to compare them to those that follow and differentiate them. And so, hardly had the delicious sensation which Swan had experienced expired before his memory had furnished him with an immediate transcript, summary and provisional, but one on which he had kept his eyes fixed, while the piece continued, so effectively that, when the same impression suddenly returned, it was no longer uncapturable. He was able to picture himself, its extent, its symmetrical arrangement, its notation, the strength of its expression. He had before him that definite object that was no longer pure music, but rather design, architecture, thought, and which allowed the actual music to be recalled. This time he had distinguished quite clearly a phrase that rose for a few moments above the waves of sound. It proposed at once to him sensual pleasures of whose existence before hearing it he had never dreamed, into which he felt that nothing but this phrase could introduce him, and he had felt it for a new and strange love. With a slow, rhythmical movement, it led him here, there, everywhere, toward a state of happiness noble, unintelligible, and distinct. And then, suddenly, having reached a certain point from which he was prepared to follow it, after pausing for a moment, abruptly it changed its direction, and in a fresh movement, more rapid, fine, melancholy, incessant, sweet, it bore him off with it toward unknown vistas, Then it vanished. He hoped with a passionate longing that he might find it again a third time. And reappear it did, though without speaking to him more clearly, bringing him indeed a pleasure less profound. But when he was once more at home, he needed it. He was like a man into whose life a woman whom he had seen for a moment passing by has brought a new form of beauty, enhances his own sensitivity without his knowing, even whether he is ever to see her again, whom he loves already, although he knows nothing of her, not even her name. Thus, this love for a musical phrase seemed for a moment to be bringing into Swann's life the possibility of a sort of rejuvenation. He had so long since ceased to direct his life toward any ideal goal, and had confined himself to the pursuit of quotidian satisfactions that he had come to believe, though without ever formally stating his belief even to himself, that he would remain all his life in that condition which death alone could alter. More than this, since his mind no longer entertained any lofty ideals, he had ceased to believe in their reality, although he had not completely denied it. He had grown into the habit of taking refuge in trivial considerations, which allowed him to set aside matters of fundamental importance, just as he had never stopped to ask himself whether he would not have done better by not going into society, even though he knew very well that if he had accepted an invitation, he must put in an appearance, and that afterward, if he did not actually call on his hostess, he must at least leave cards. Just as in his conversation, he took care never to express with any warmth a personal opinion about things, but instead would supply concrete details that had a value of a sort in themselves, and excused him from showing how much he really knew. He would be extremely precise about the recipe for a dish, the dates of a painter's birth and death, and the titles of his works. Sometimes, in spite of himself, he would let himself go as far as to utter a criticism of a work of art or of someone's interpretation of life, but then he would cloak his words in a tone of irony, as though he did not altogether subscribe to what he was saying. But now, like certain confirmed invalids in whom all of a sudden the country they have arrived in, or a new course of treatment, or, as sometimes happens, an organic change in themselves, spontaneous and mysterious, brings about such a regression of their illness that they begin to envisage the possibility, hitherto beyond all hope, of starting to lead, and better late than never, a wholly different life. Swann found in himself, in the memory of the phrase that he had heard, in certain other sonatas that he asked people to play for him to see whether or not he might discover his phrase among them, the present of one of those invisible realities in which he had ceased to believe, but in which, as though the music had had on the moral barrenness from which he was suffering a sort of sympathetic influence, he felt once again the desire, almost the strength, to consecrate his life. But never having managed to find out whose work it was that he had heard played that evening, he had been unable to procure a copy, and finally had forgotten it. He had indeed, in the course of the next few days, encountered several of the people who had been at the party with him, and had questioned them, but most of them had either arrived after or left before the piece was played. Some had indeed been in the house, but had gone into another room to talk, and those who had stayed to listen had no clearer impression than the rest. As for his hosts, they knew that it was a new work that the musicians whom they had engaged for the evening had asked to be allowed to play, but as these last were now on tour somewhere, Swann could learn nothing further. He had, of course, a number of musical friends, but vividly as he could recall the exquisite and inexpressible pleasure that the little phrase had given him, and could see still before his eyes the forms that it had traced in outline, he was quite incapable of humming the phrase to them. And so at last, he ceased to think of it. But scarcely a few minutes after the little pianist had begun to play, at Madame Vetaran's, suddenly, after a high note held for a long time through two whole measures, Swann saw it approaching. stealing forth from underneath the resonance, which was prolonged and stretched out over it like a curtain of sound, to veil the mystery of its birth and recognize secret whispering, articulate the airy and fragrant phrase that he had loved. And it was so peculiarly itself, it had so personal a charm which no other could have replaced, that Swann felt as though he had met, in a friend's drawing room, a woman whom he had seen and admired once in the street, and had despaired of ever seeing her again. Finally, the phrase withdrew, pointing, directing, diligent among the wandering currents of its fragrance, leaving on Swann's face a reflection of its smile. But now at last he could ask the name of this unknown woman, and was told that it was the andante movement of Vinteuil's sonata for the piano and violin. He held it safe, could have it again to himself, at home, as often as he liked, could study its language and acquire its secret. And so, when the pianist had finished, Swann went up to him to express his gratitude with a vivacity that delighted Madame Vetaran. "Isn't he charming?" she asked Swann. "Doesn't he understand it, his sonata, the little wretch? You never dreamed, did you, that a piano could be made to achieve all that? Upon my word, there's everything in it except the piano. I'm fooled every time I hear it. I think I'm listening to an orchestra, though it's better really than an orchestra, more complete." The young pianist bowed and, smiling, underlining each of his words as though he were making a witty remark. "You are most generous to me," he said. And while Madame Vetaran was saying to her husband, "Run and fetch him a glass of orangeade, it's well earned," Swann began to tell Odette how he had fallen in love with that little phrase. When Madame Vetaran, who was a little way off, called out, "Well, it looks to me as though someone is saying nice things to you, Odette," she replied, "Yes, very nice." And Swann found her simplicity delightful. Then he asked for some information about this Vinteuil, about his works, and at what period in his life he had composed the sonata, about what meaning this little phrase could have had for him. That was what Swann wanted most to know.